Good morning, and I want to thank you for indulging us for the additional 2 minutes as we delayed in an effort to accommodate some of the people who were late coming on this morning. My name is Dennis Vegas, and on behalf of Cornerstone and Acclaim Energy Mexico, we want to thank you for joining us this morning on this important subject matter, ESG, how to develop and implement a successful ESG program, what it takes, and what are some of the best practices that your organizations can apply as they move forward in this journey. Again, my name is Dennis Vegas, and today we have two of the most knowledgeable people in this particular space, this ESG space. One of them is, of course, Maria Jose Trevino, and the other one is Jack Belcher. But let me just give a formal introduction to Maria Jose. Maria Jose is the country manager for Acclaim Energy, an advisory firm that serves businesses throughout Mexico as well as Latin America and North America. Their specialty is obviously on helping organizations like yours manage energy as it relates to issues also like ESG and sustainability, etc. Her team currently manages about $3 billion in annual energy spend for clients throughout those various markets. Now, Maria Jose has been widely recognized as one of the most powerful women in business in Mexico and one of the top 10 women in energy by multiple industry media and a top voice on sustainability by LinkedIn. And that's globally, not just for Mexico. In 2020, she was given the honorary medal for the energy industry by the International Association of Entrepreneurs. She is currently a member of the Mexican Council of Foreign Affairs, COMEX, a member of the BBVA Advisory Board for the state of Nuevo León, and also acts as an independent board member for multiple public and private corporations with a presence throughout 10 countries around the world. Maria Jose has 2 bachelor's degrees, one in administration and one in Mandarin Chinese from Trinity University, as well as, and I apologize, those were both from Trinity University, as well as an MBA from IPADRE, a business school in Mexico. So I'd like to take a moment now to introduce our other panelist, whose name is Jack Belcher. And Jack Belcher is a Cornerstone principal with more than 25 years of experience in energy policy, and sustainability development. Jack provides strategic and tactical advice to energy and transportation companies, financial institutions, focusing on government relations, regulatory affairs, public policy, strategic communications, risk management, and of course, the subject of today, ESG, environmental, social, and governance. Jack previously served as Executive Vice President of HBW Resources. He was also Regulatory Affairs and Policy Manager for Shell North America Exploration and Production Division, and a Staff Director for the U.S. House of Representatives Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources. Jack also previously worked for an Independent Petroleum Association of America, Hart Energy Publications, and Texaco Gas Marketing. He is certified, most importantly, he is certified by, I'm sorry, something's covering my screen. Someone said hello from Madrid, but okay. Well, he is, most importantly, he is certified by the Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards, a very, very important organization, and the Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And Jack holds a BA in government from the University of Texas at Austin. Now, just a few housekeeping issues before we begin. For those of you who don't know, Acclaim Energy and Cornerstone established a strategic alliance earlier this year for the specific purpose of helping organizations like yours address their most pressing challenges when it comes to ESG. Today, as we all know, sustainability information has dramatically shifted the landscape for business disclosures, risk, and performance management. The rise of ESG investment and lending trends has established new business requirements for corporate ESG and sustainability, data management, analytics, and workflows. Now, before I pass the baton over to Maria Jose, I want to let you know that everyone's microphone is on mute, so you don't have to worry about that. But most importantly, if you have a question or a concern, please don't be afraid to use the Q&A icon or the chat icon at the bottom of your screen, and we will address those questions or concerns at the conclusion of the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Maria Jose Trevino, again, the country manager for Acclaim Energy. Maria?
Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you all for joining us from apparently different parts of the world. So as the ESG trend becomes more and more relevant, organizations in Mexico and Latin America are exploring what is ESG, why do I implement an ESG strategy, why do I invest in it, what do I get out of it, and how do I start? So this webinar marks the start of a series of content production that we'll be sharing so that your company can start the process, create a strategy, implement it, and then report out. It's an ongoing and challenging process. It's not easy. It brings a lot of benefits and opportunities in the long run, and hopefully we can be of service to you during the journey. As you all know, Acclaim Energy has over 18 years of experience in supporting medium-sized and large energy consumers, managing over $2.5 billion in energy spent a year for over 500 clients by designing and executing their procurement strategies around electricity and natural gas, which often goes hand in hand with sustainability and cost reduction goals. And in fact, we've supported 50% of companies that have issued sustainability or green bonds to meet ESG goals in Mexico only. Early last month, we announced our new strategic alliance with Cornerstone, a consulting company with around 120 employees offering ESG services for over 400 clients. And our intention is to combine both our local market expertise in terms of regulation, pricing, technology, and network with Cornerstone's extensive experience in advising on ESG, on sustainability programs and decarbonization as a strategy, execution, and reporting goes hand in hand. Their members are certified by the Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards and Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So next slide, please. I'd like to start with a very basic, something very basic. What is ESG, right? ESG is an extremely extensive concept with many different branches and principles that organizations must adopt to sustain long-term value. Each industry and particular company has its own ways to implement each one of these different categories. The E represents environmental, which takes into account climate change strategies, biodiversity, water, energy efficiency, type of procurement, carbon intensity, environmental management systems, just to name a few. Sometimes we just focus on carbon emissions, but in reality, there's just so much more to it. The S is for social, which encompasses processes to ensure equal opportunities, freedom of association, health and safety, human rights, community commitment, customer and products responsibilities, child labor, etc. And the G is for governance, to ensure business ethics, compliance, board independence, executive compensation, and shareholder democracy. Next slide, please. Now, why are these principles important? Companies worldwide are engaging in or integrating environmental, social, and governance principles into their business strategies. And in Mexico and Latin America, we tend to see implementation being carried out in response to corporate requisites. Public companies of local origin have also begun deep diving into critical strategies and reporting based on pressure, maybe from financial institutions and from their competitors. However, organizations of all sizes are already getting involved in this critical yet complex journey to manage investor, consumer, and NGO expectations. So it's proven that companies that embrace ESG principles have lower costs of capital, higher valuations, are less vulnerable to risks, and are more profitable in the long term. ESG is one of the most important business strategies that investors, policymakers, and other key stakeholders are closely monitoring to ensure long-term and sustainable value creation. And ESG addresses a broad cross-section of issues from CO2 emissions to labor practices, compliance, reporting, and investor ratings. So successful businesses take proactive measures to develop ESG plans that mitigate the adverse impact to their brand's reputation and long-term viability. Next, please. So what are the benefits of adopting these ESG principles? By adopting ESG principles, consumers develop a greater preference to a product or service, increasing revenue in a sustainable manner. It also allows organizations to dive more effectively into new markets and expand in current ones. And according to S&P Global Market Intelligence data, over 50% of the ESG-linked funds outperformed the S&P 500 in Q1 2021, just as an example. They tracked the price change for 27 ESG exchange-traded funds and mutual funds with over $250 million in assets under management. And in 7 months, almost 60% performed better than the S&P 500. So if you're looking for sustainable long-term value creation and improved financial performance, ESG is proving to be a valuable strategy. Now, ESG implementation also produces cost efficiencies due to the adoption of best practices. Sometimes there are competitive RFPs, for example, carried out to evaluate different alternatives, which is what we do with a lot of you for energy procurement. At other times, there's a more profound due diligence of the suppliers. For example, companies adding renewable energy to their portfolio in Mexico could save anywhere from 10 to 25% against the regulated tariff. That's just one example. Waste management strategies, raw material optimization, energy, water efficiency, they're all actions that should produce a decrease in operating expenses. In fact, McKinsey research has found that efficiencies produced by ESG can affect operating profits by as much as 60%. So it does generate this economic benefit. So the bottom line growth can be utilized for development opportunities, research and development, new product creation, payment of dividends, other priorities that the company has, which can in turn multiply the benefit and investor confidence. On another note, financial institutions are running due diligence processes as we speak on organizations requesting access to capital. And more we'll see this tendency. Financing conditions are becoming more attractive for organizations focusing their investments and efforts on ensuring long-term value creation. So good ESG business plans can enhance performance, reduce the risk in investors' eyes as well, and ensure greater stakeholder well-being, which means higher credit ratings and better loan conditions. Today, public companies are being regulated by growing ESG trend compliance, and companies issuing green and sustainability bonds are designing, implementing, and reporting on strategies that guarantee their compliance. So applying ESG principles attracts investors. Also, clients, employees, investors, and governments are demanding more responsible practices. Companies that adopt ESG principles gain a better reputation and consumer perception than those that don't. All stakeholders are impacted by this type of ESG approach and therefore tend to create stronger relationships with the communities, investors, employees, and just the general public. So this in turn can protect one's brands and provide organizations a competitive advantage that drives risk downward and reaps economic benefits. And on the last note, employee side, attraction, retention, motivation, and performance have been directly linked to successful ESG implementation, especially among young professionals. Promoting diversity, including gender, race, beliefs, and age, has proven to create greater value in leadership and work teams. So linking sustainability goals to compensation strategies for senior management, that also drives change and value creation in a top-down approach. Working for a responsible company that embraces ESG and reports their metrics will improve employee morale, which drives performance and therefore positive shareholder returns. Next slide, please. So if you're not convinced already, here are 10 key actions that should be taken in order to successfully implement an ESG approach. One is balance your focus between growth, profits, and ESG to achieve a competitive advantage. Carefully manage ESG trade-offs regarding climate action, decarbonization, and your energy suppliers. Deviate from all the greenwashing that some companies have gone into. Conduct due diligence to ensure you're optimizing your operations to meet ESG standards that can impact your ability to raise capital. Embrace products and services that are climate friendly and responsibly sourced. Maintain a continuous dialogue with regulators and policymakers to ensure the best practices and compliance norms are being followed. Be transparent and open about your actions and progress. Always report out transparently. If you're a multinational, ensure that your approach is inclusive of different cultures and regulations. Remember that what's being applied in Germany might not be applicable to Mexico or to Guatemala, right? ESG plans must be designed not solely for today, but shaped for the future. This is a tendency that's in development. Executives should be engaged in the development of ESG initiatives because of the vast implications across the business. It's key to engage the leaders and do a top-down approach. And finally, demonstrate your accountability and performance by vetting your results with outside sources. And now I want to turn the mic to our partner, Jack Belcher from Cornerstone. We'll go deeper in detail to the how and the whys of ESG. Jack. I think you're on mute, Jack. And if we can switch the slide.
Next slide. Great. Well, thank you, Maria Jose, and thank you, Dennis, for getting us started today. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Good afternoon to some of you, it sounds like. So first, I want to talk about the evolution of ESG. Recognizing that ESG is a fairly recent phenomenon in Mexico, it's important to know that its roots go far back to the Great Depression of the 1930s. It was during this time that the public and governments started calling for greater transparency and disclosure of corporate financial performance. And it was also during this time that private corporations and governments began developing greater standardization around financial accounting. Another big factor was the environmental movement that emerged from the 1960s and 70s, and then later merged with the climate change movement and the UN climate conferences that had goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and led companies who were pushed by their investors to start to quantify and disclose their environmental performance. That includes greenhouse gas emissions, carbon indices, and commitments to reducing emissions and addressing climate risks. The term materiality, which is very important in ESG and you're going to hear about today, is a term that's related to disclosure. It was defined in the 1970s as a legal standard, but it's become a standard in terms of measuring disclosure. Corporate social responsibility, another term that we've all heard, was first discussed in the 1950s, but became a real movement in the 1990s when companies really started to advertise their commitments and contributions to society. Sustainable development was born out of a United Nations report in the 1980s. In 1987, it was titled Our Common Future. And that led to the disclosure of sustainability data and led to companies publishing sustainability reports. In 2005, the term ESG emerged from a conference titled Who Cares Wins? And it grew as institutional investors embraced this concept and demanded ESG performance over time. Standards for ESG investing that we're going to talk about later today emerged in the mid to late 2010s. And then in early 2020, BlackRock chairman and CEO Larry Fink wrote the letter to investors that was titled Fundamental Reshaping of Finance. This was a watershed event. It placed sustainability at the center of BlackRock's investment approach. And this was a tipping point in terms of accelerating ESG worldwide. It brought a surge of ESG commitments from investors and led to the level of ESG investing that we're seeing today. Cemex and PHMSA are examples of Mexican companies that were disclosing ESG data years before the BlackRock letter. And now we're seeing growth and growing interest in ESG in Mexico among a broader set of companies. Although many of the companies that are leaning into ESG now are disclosing information that is not tied to ESG frameworks. Data from MSCI indicates that banks, chemicals, construction materials, and the media and entertainment industries in Mexico have been the most engaged industries in Mexico on ESG. Next slide. So why engage ESG now? Well, we're seeing tremendous momentum, as Maria Jose referred to earlier, into ESG investing. And this is due to a number of factors. First, there's climate risk. Companies are responding to increasing pressure from investors, from governments, and the general public to address climate change factors and risks. ESG is an excellent platform for addressing those risks. It really forces discipline and forces companies to commit to addressing those risks. We also have shifting investor priorities. There's an ongoing major global shift by investors towards investments that have high ESG performance, and they're moving away from those that are low performers. This is especially true among younger investors who are most concerned with a lot of the social factors and environmental factors. Then there's regulatory pressure, where increasingly regulators around the world are requiring different types of ESG disclosure, and this includes greenhouse gas emissions and carbon index. This is a trend that we see and believe is going to be accelerating in the coming years, and we're seeing it this year already. Some examples of and evidence of this include the EU taxonomy regulation and the EU Green Deal in Europe. And in the US, where a Securities and Exchange Commission rulemaking is underway, just went underway recently, to mandate greenhouse gas emissions disclosure. So these are recent phenomenon that are reverberating globally. And this is important to companies operating in Mexico because you may be selling goods into these markets, or you may offer services to companies based in those jurisdictions. Increasingly, companies are surveying their vendors and customers about ESG performance and about climate change factors. This is something we're seeing. Our clients are coming to us after they receive these surveys to ask advice about how to fill them out. And they're indicative of the fact that companies are increasingly wanting to ensure that the goods and services they're receiving meet certain criteria. There's also global trade. Europe is moving toward a carbon standard for imported products and commodities with a carbon border adjustment tax that's assessed on companies that don't meet these standards. We believe that over time, other companies are going to impose carbon or ESG related standards as well. And this is going to impact global trade. We see this as a phenomenon that's going to play out globally and impact trade. Another point is that better technology and data are enabling investors and other stakeholders to have greater insights into ESG performance. And this is being demanded by the market. At the same time, ESG data is increasingly tied to performance, and there are bigger efforts underway to quantify ESG value. And this is an important point. ESG valuation, the way you measure the impact of ESG on a company's performance, is a real phenomenon, something that's happening as we speak. Markets increasingly expect ESG performance, and there's a greater feeling of responsibility within the organizations, within companies, to act. For instance, 91% of business leaders believe that their company has a responsibility to act on ESG issues. And this is an issue of employee attraction and retention, as 86% of employees prefer to support or work for companies that care about the same issues that they care about. And it's also consumer driven. 83% of consumers think that companies should be actively shaping ESG practices. Next slide. So done correctly, studies consistently link strong ESG performance in environmental, social, and governance areas with better financial performance. And you can see how these ESG factors relate to financial performance on this slide. 58% of corporate studies show that there's a positive link between ESG and financial performance, with only 8% showing a negative performance. A recent study by McKinsey & Company showed that ESG creates value through top-line growth, cost reductions, reduced regulatory and legal interventions, employee product uplift, and investment in asset optimization. It's also been proven to be an excellent risk mitigation tool. And I can't emphasize this enough. It really helps companies identify risks across the organization in the environmental, social, and governance categories, and it causes them to put procedures and processes in place to mitigate those risks. We've seen companies reorganize departments and processes due to findings that resulted from their ESG programs. They find gaps in what they're doing, they find problems, and then they go out and they fix them. So it's a great opportunity for companies, and it's extremely beneficial in the long run. ESG also improves communications within organizations. Because ESG is performed corporate-wide throughout an organization, it creates new channels of communication, stronger teams, and the ability to communicate things across corporate-wide. It also improves employee morale because it gives employees a common cause to rally around. And as was stated earlier, it improves employee retention and helps with recruitment. A lot of younger job seekers want to know how the companies that they're looking to work for are performing in these areas. And ESG is an excellent way to quantify and show the value and show the performance in these areas. In Mexico, Europe, Asia, and the US, ESG performance is increasingly being linked to financial performance. Next slide. So a successful ESG program requires buy-in at the top from the board and the C-suite. This is very important. To get started on an ESG program, you really need that support at the top. But a committee structure is a useful way to manage ESG internally. So it's important to establish an ESG committee that can include different parts of the organization. To get greater buy-in and a wider selection of insights, these committees should really reflect a diversity of levels of management and functions throughout an organization. The committees should identify potential areas for ESG performance improvements, and this is a constant process, and as well as ways to track, report, and communicate ESG progress. 75% of companies that are performing ESG have a single ESG leader within the organization that's responsible for the execution and reporting of ESG. Some of these have wider dedicated ESG teams, full-time people that are working on ESG within an organization. ESG leaders can be housed in a variety of different places within an organization, and we've seen in different companies, they house it in different places, such as legal, finance, corporate affairs, and investor relations. Also, increasingly, organizations are publishing an ESG report, and that's a report that discloses ESG data, performance, and commitments. A couple of examples. CEMEX, I mentioned earlier, they publish data using a variety of international frameworks, and we're going to talk about those frameworks later in this discussion. PHMSA has a sustainability, inclusion, and diversity committee, and it features that. It discusses it in their ESG report. ESG goal setting is also critical to long-term success of an organization, really setting those goals, looking at the first year of disclosure and then out to subsequent years. Each year, organizations should look back to improve their ESG performance and make new commitments. Next slide. I'm going to talk about ESG standards, frameworks, and ratings. So global standards and networks have been developed to help companies determine which ESG issues and metrics they should focus on. You can see on the screen that a number of them are displayed here. Some of them focus on climate reporting and data, such as the CDP and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Others look at broader, more investment-focused things. They take an approach of a broader investor-focused view. Examples include SASB, and SASB establishes metrics based on sector and financial materiality. There's also the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, which takes an even broader approach and looks at the broader societal impacts of a company's operations. And then the United Nations Global Compact commits its members to 10 principles that are related to human rights, labor issues, environment, and anti-corruption. It's important to note that you can choose between these standards, drawing metrics from multiple standards. And most companies that we work with do that. We look at the different reporting standards and frameworks and choose from each one. So like credit agencies, the ESG rating agencies analyze ESG performance of companies. And that includes companies in Mexico. And it gives them a rating or score based on their performance. The criteria that is used to rate these companies is not consistent, and it varies from agency to agency. Some judge companies by their performance within their own sectors, and others rate them more broadly across sectors. This is a problem for the more carbon-intensive industries, since it's hard to compare a mining company or a manufacturer with a retail company. There's a lot of discussion about the different types of rating agencies and some of the inconsistency, but that's something that's being dealt with over time. Some of the larger rating agencies like MSCI, Sustainalytics, and Bloomberg are more widely used than some of the others. Many of the agencies work with companies to understand how they can improve their scores. So this is important. You'll get a rating. You want to understand why you got the certain score. You can work with those rating agencies, and you can do that proactively, which is nice. It's common for companies to use outside consultants to help them develop the strategies for dealing with the rating agencies. And that's a reflection of the importance that some companies place on how they are rated in terms of their ESG performance. Next slide. So in developing an ESG strategy, it's important that companies develop a unique strategy, one that's appropriate for the needs of their enterprise and their specific stakeholders. It's also important to understand your current state. Where are you now and where do you want to be? One size does not fit all when it comes to ESG. A company's approach must be tailored, and ESG factors can be integrated in multiple ways. Companies that we've worked with often find they are further along in the process at the beginning than they thought they were. And that's because a lot of the work's already been done. They just haven't categorized it or defined it as being ESG. So when you start an ESG program, you're going to find that a lot of the things that are required for a positive disclosure have been done already. Building internal awareness and cultural commitment is critical to ESG success. And that, I can't emphasize this enough. You really need to build a culture within an organization that embraces ESG, because you have to have buy-in from throughout the organization. You also need to understand your priority of stakeholders. What's important to them? This is essential for ESG reporting, because those outside stakeholders are much of the audience that you're providing the ESG disclosure for. And you should report on ESG related information that best aligns with your company's values and strategy. There are a lot of different ESG metrics. You can't report on them all in the beginning. You might have some that you don't report even further along. You want to choose the ones that bring you the most value and the ones you're able to achieve. ESG frameworks differ. They differ from framework to framework. You can choose the one, or you can choose multiple frameworks to guide your disclosures. And it's important to assess your peers and understand how you compare to them in terms of ESG metrics and in performance. This is a very important piece of ESG disclosure, understanding what your peers are doing, how are they performing, and how is that being received by the market. ESG requires ongoing maintenance. It's not a one-time effort, but rather an annual commitment to maintaining ESG reporting and using the same methodology year after year. Next slide. Well, this slide demonstrates the process, the ESG implementation process that we utilize when we work with companies that want to put ESG programs together and disclose. The pathway to disclosure can be done in a matter of months or a year or longer. And this is based on your capacity to engage in the process and the rigor in which you pursue it. But once a company decides to launch an ESG program, it needs to build internal awareness. And that's a very important part of the process. I mentioned ESG peer benchmarking. This is a process that helps you understand how your peers are performing in terms of ESG. What are they disclosing and how they're disclosing? And this will be a big driver in determining what you disclose first and what you look at in the long term. A high-level ESG assessment helps you to, and tells you how your company is performing, and it helps identify strengths and weaknesses. Where are you in the beginning? How are you performing in these different areas? Then we go through a deeper dive assessment, and that's where we look at specific ESG issues and determine how you're performing in each one of those. The next phase is the materiality assessment. And this is done to survey your corporate leaders across business units and functions and potentially outside stakeholders. It helps you determine what metrics are material and what you should consider disclosing. So the term materiality was initially a legal definition, but now it's globally recognized to mean a topic or a fact that should be made available to a reasonable investor. A material topic could have an impact on the total mix of information impacting an investor's decision-making. Metrics that are disclosed under ESG are considered to be material. And determining materiality requires a process with input from multiple sources. A materiality assessment is the process by which internal and sometimes external stakeholders high-grade issues and determine which issues are material. It's a critical piece of ESG, and all the major frameworks assume that you're performing a materiality assessment. It ultimately helps companies determine what they're going to disclose. We're going to show you a sample materiality assessment on the next slide. An ESG statement is a written proclamation about your commitment to ESG, how it reflects your mission, vision, and values. So this is an important process that you go through, getting buy-in on an ESG statement that the company can then put out on its website, disclose to the world about its commitment. And then finally, you determine what metrics you want to disclose. You determine how you want to disclose them and the strategy for communicating the disclosures, both internally and externally. ESG disclosure, again, is not a one-time event. There's maintenance involved. You should update and potentially add to your disclosures on a yearly basis. Next slide. So here is a sample materiality assessment chart. This is a common chart that's used to plot different issues in terms of materiality. The results of the survey are displayed on a grid like the one you see here, and they can be measured in terms of the level of potential benefits that you would get from disclosure and the difficulty in implementing them. They're also categorized in terms of quick wins, short to medium term opportunities, and long-term opportunities. And this prioritization can help determine what metrics should be part of an initial disclosure. It's a big part of making that determination. Next slide. So to show how big ESG has become, here are a few interesting statistics. $17 trillion of professionally managed assets at the start of 2020 were under strategies that considered ESG criteria in their investment processes and decision-making. And that compares to only $8 trillion in 2016 and $2.5 trillion in 2010. So we're seeing tremendous growth in the amount of dollars that are being tied to ESG. About 80% of asset owners view not integrating ESG factors as a material risk. That's a huge number. 65% of institutional investors believe that ESG will become a standard practice in the next 5 years. And 73% of institutional investors would be more likely to buy a fund that demonstrated a smaller carbon footprint than ones that don't. Next slide. So what are the more significant trends we're seeing in ESG today? Well, we're seeing smaller companies, even privately held companies, increasingly embracing ESG. And that's for all of the reasons that we've discussed today. Banks and other financial institutions are scrutinizing ESG disclosures and making decisions based upon them. And we're seeing a lot of ESG due diligence being done when mergers and acquisitions are occurring. ESG and climate disclosure are increasingly being pushed by regulators globally, as we mentioned before, and that's having an impact globally. And disclosures are increasing outside the US and Europe, including Latin America and more specifically in Mexico. We're seeing an increase in stakeholder activism regarding climate and ESG issues. This is becoming a more effective tool that organizations, NGOs, are using to drive corporate behavior. And that's, last year we saw a real proliferation in that activity. The use of green bonds that Maria Jose mentioned earlier is a growing tool to fund sustainable projects, including a number of projects in Mexico. And companies around the world are assessing their greenhouse gas emissions, making plans to reduce them, and you'll hear it every day, new companies making zero carbon commitments. Nations are attempting to live up to commitments that they made this past year at the United Nations COP26 Climate Change Summit. A lot of commitments were made in Glasgow when that summit took place, and now countries are finding that they're under pressure to push that ESG performance or climate reduction, greenhouse gas emissions reductions performance. And that's spurring investment in new technologies. Technologies like carbon capture and storage that are needed and are being made every day to accomplish those commitments. ESG is firmly establishing itself globally as a normalized and essential factor in business today. So thank you for your participation, and we look forward to your questions and your interest. ESG is a journey that can help your company thrive and grow. We believe it's the future. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Maria Jose, and thank you, Jack, for that. Wow, it's a lot to absorb and a pretty challenging and sophisticated journey. During the presentation, we received a number of questions, and so I'd like to get after it to keep the dialogue going. So, Jack, one of the ones we have for you is, how do I get my CEO on board if he hasn't been mandated by our parent company?
Well, we've seen this situation before, and there are primarily the approach is to that linkage between ESG performance and financial performance. Really driving that home is critical. Showing the relationship between the two and showing how investors are really focused on ESG and performance. But what really I think makes the case is if you're able to do a peer assessment and show how your peers are performing, how your peers are doing ESG and what those results are, that's a real opportunity to make a case to your CEO, especially when you show that you're lagging behind. But even if your peers aren't doing much, because it shows that you have an opportunity to be a leader. So that's really, those are really ways that we've seen your companies, people within companies are able to make the case to their leadership to put an ESG program together and to commit to disclosing ESG metrics.
Thank you, Jack. Maria Jose, I know you've been quiet for a while, but we've got a couple of questions for you. Because this is new for many of us in Mexico, how do we develop the leadership, the skills, and expertise to drive the ESG strategies and outcomes we need in order to protect our brand and our revenue streams?
I think it all starts with needing that leadership buy-in that was just mentioned. The need to understand the importance and benefits of doing this. I think if leadership understands what the importance or the benefits of doing this is, I think we'll all be aligned in actually executing and designing strategy all the way down. Defining set goals and having each department recognize what they need to do to contribute to the overall value creation through this ESG compliance. Sometimes there are companies that link bonuses to achieving these goals as well. And not only to the leadership. I had a meeting maybe 2 days ago with the energy team, right, of a company. And they were all linked, their bonuses were all linked. And they said, we have to be able to do this. And I mean, that's a very big incentive of driving change.
We're seeing that happen more and more every day, and it's very effective. It really is a great way to get leadership and the whole organization involved. And the bonus structures is tied to ESG performance. It's a big deal. It's a big shift. Another thing I'd want to add too is, you approach ESG and everybody hears about it, but there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of stuff there, right? And there are resources out there that you can utilize to learn about ESG. There are organizations like SASB, CDP, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and MSCI that we talked about earlier. They have tools and things on their website that courses in some cases. There are a lot of different ways to learn about ESG. So utilizing those tools and getting yourself up to speed with what it is another good way to get ahead of ESG.
Thank you both. This one, Jack, is directed at you, and maybe Maria Jose might want to chime in on it because of her local understanding of the market. But it says, I understand the Paris Accord and the efforts globally to protect the planet, but why is ESG important for Mexico?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. First, we live in a global environment. Our commerce is global. ESG is happening around the globe. And for companies to sell into different markets, they're going to need to demonstrate ESG performance. I mentioned what's happening in Europe in terms of trade, the trade tariffs that are coming along that are going to be tied to carbon. That's a phenomenon that we think is going to take place in other places. So it's having an impact everywhere. But ESG performance is also, as we mentioned before, key to customer value, to gaining new customers, for keeping customers as they look at ESG performance. It's key to employee retention and recruitment, which we mentioned earlier. And the risk management value of ESG is something I think is extremely valuable. When you're able to, with rigor, look throughout your organization, identify how you're performing in different areas, and then make modifications in terms of what you see in terms of gaps and things that you could do better, I think that really drives value. And that's a reason that companies in Mexico and everywhere in the world ought to be looking at ESG.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, sorry, Dennis. Yeah, just to add to that, when we talk about the Paris Agreement, one thing is what governments are doing to incentivize lower carbon emissions and therefore as a whole reach this Paris Agreement commitments. And unfortunately, locally, we're not seeing many incentives in reaching these goals as a country. But companies, however, have taken this upon them because they can't stop being proactive around these principles that have this business perspective. As Jack mentioned, it's aligned with business growth, right? It's aligned with getting financing. It's aligned with being able to export, to being able to do trading, being able to continue within a certain supply chain, being able to maintain one of your clients, attracting more investors, being compliant with other governments that are pushing for this. So all of this is being demanded in terms of social and environmental commitments. So it's basically up to companies who are taking it on their back to push through and meet these goals, making them more competitive individually, then their industry more competitive, and then as a nation, we reach these goals quicker.
Thank you. This question, Jack, is for you. It says, we're on our journey. We're starting out on our journey, but who can help us validate? You talk about the credibility and integrity of the results. Who can help us validate our performance to ensure integrity of our accomplishments and results?
Well, that's a great question because we tend to, and we see it all the time, certain companies have different personalities, right? And some companies are more confident than others, and sometimes they're overconfident. And we see companies that look at their performance in these areas and they say, oh, we're doing that, we're doing great at that. And they're dismissive, okay, of maybe some of the internal criticism that should be taking place, the scrutiny that ought to be taking place. So it's good to bring in folks from the outside, starting with your own stakeholders, right? You can do a materiality assessment, a full-blown assessment, utilizing input from stakeholders outside, and that's very helpful. You don't have to do that during materiality. You can go to your stakeholders and ask their opinion. How are we doing in certain areas? And then it's important, I think, to have an outside organization guide you through the process, consult with you through the steps. Organizations don't have people with natural abilities to perform all these things, right? They're growing those capabilities inside. And to bring somebody from the outside not only helps you make sure that you're doing things the right way and that your disclosures are valid and they're in line with global standards, but it's also helping you to train internally. And that's very important, being able to train your employees to have the capacity to do this. Because as I mentioned before, it's not a one-time thing. It's a new process that we're all going to be looking at moving forward. I think you're on mute, Dennis.
I apologize. This next question says, I know you mentioned CEMEX and you mentioned FINSA as being organizations that took a leadership role. But for many of us that are just starting out, how often do you share results when you first begin your journey? 6 months, 1 year? How should we define that?
Well, there are different audiences for sharing your results too. And I think first, internally, it's very important. Okay, when you set up an ESG program, you're putting a structure together where you've got participation and buy-in from different parts of an organization. Those results need to be reported on very often. You've got a work plan, you've got goals. They need to be stated at the very top of the organization on a fairly regular basis, and then within the different functions, within the different departments, and within different teams in an organization. So very often should these things should be reported at the internal level. Externally, you really want to share these things with your stakeholders that you're working with, but you're not going to take that. You want to make an announcement that you're dedicating yourself, you're committing yourself to putting an ESG program. So that's something that can be that you can share externally. But as you're going through the process, you're really going to be focused on getting to disclosure. And then disclosure is a big opportunity to announce what you've done, the fact that you've been successful in doing it, and that you're committed to these things moving forward. So internally, I think it's a constant almost discussion of what your progress is. Externally, there are a few different opportunities. Another one I failed to mention too is the establishment of an ESG statement. When you've done that, that's something you want to put out externally. It's an opportunity to reflect your commitment to ESG and how that's tied to the values within your corporation.
And there, just to add something there, Dennis, I think, how often you disclose is one thing, and then what do you disclose is another thing, right? And that also it starts from an internal discussion and looking at what's being required from you, what your goals are, what do you need to disclose to financial corporations, to your clients, to the supply chain, to internally, to corporate. And that becomes a constant. And then how are you measuring those results? Are you using technology? Are you using a consultant? Are you using, and that's what provokes that ongoing internal discussion that Jack is mentioning.
That's a very good point. And I think once you've done your initial disclosure, then you have the opportunity to do it externally more often, right? You've got something out there that's concrete. It's in the public eye. You have the opportunity to put this data out, on investor calls, and we're seeing that. I mean, that there are lots of questions around ESG in these investor calls, and in your annual reporting and quarterly reporting, all of these are opportunities as well. But once you've made that initial disclosure, then there are lots of opportunities, and then of course, it's expected on a yearly basis once you've made your initial disclosure that you're going to disclose again each year.
Well, we're going to have to leave it right there out of respect for everybody's time. First of all, we want to thank all of you, all of the organizations that took time out of their busy schedules to join us today. On behalf of Jack Belcher and Maria Jose, we want to give you extend our deepest appreciation for your time. We also want to let you know that, as promised when you registered for this particular seminar, we're going to be forwarding to your attention more insights, more best practices, more details about how to develop and deploy an effective ESG program in a white paper that will be sent to you this coming week. So I hope that you'll watch your inboxes accordingly. It'll be coming under the Acclaim Energy and Cornerstone moniker. And I just again want to say thank you for your time. And that concludes our program for today. Have a blessed day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody.